Postgraduate from the Faculty of Economics and Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya. Okay, the program will continue with the keynote lecture delivered by our guest speaker, Professor Dr. Emmanuel Skoufias. Okay, and then the floor is open for question at the end of the session. So before we invite all the guests for light refreshment that will be served outside the auditorium, maybe please to request the entire gathering for a group photo session inside the auditorium. Okay. Also, please kindly ensure that mobile phones are in silent mode. So I thank you for your cooperation. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning. The respectful Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, World Bank Country Manager for Malaysia, Professor Dr. Yong Chen Chen, Deputy Dean, Postgraduate Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya, Professor Dr. Emmanuel Skoufias, Guest Speaker from the National University of Singapore, Dr. Sharifah Muhaira Shahabuddin, Head, Department of Political Science, Public Administration and Development Studies, Faculty of Business and Economic, University Malaya, representative from the World Bank Group, academician, students, and all participants. Welcome to the keynote lecture, Economic Development in a Livable Planet. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Fazli Aziz. It is my pleasure to be the host, the MC for this beautiful morning. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We appreciate you taking time off from your tight schedule to join us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, keynote lecture, Economic Development in a Livable Planet, is a collaborative effort between the World Bank Group Malaysia and the Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya. The program aims to provide a platform where the future of household vulnerability can be examined through a holistic lens, leading to a better knowledge sharing in the challenging economic spectrum. And now, to kick off the program this morning, it is my pleasure to invite Deputy Dean, Postgraduate, Faculty of Business and Economics, University Malaya, Professor Dr. Yong Chen Chen, to deliver her welcoming remarks. Please welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fazli, the MCs for today's event. Good morning. Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, the Country Manager for Malaysia World Bank. Professor Emmanuel Skoufias, our keynote speaker, visiting professors from National University of Singapore. Okay, distinguished guests from World Bank, faculty members, students, and respected audiences. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the Faculty of Business and Economics. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the keynote lecture delivered by Professor Emmanuel Skoufias. This event is jointly organized by and World Bank Group, and today's session will be moderated by Professor VGR Chandran and Dr. Sonia Kumari. So the lecture is timely and it will explore the topics of adaptive social protections, where various targeting strategies based on household vulnerability to poverty will be highlighted. Okay, poverty and socioeconomic inequalities created challenges to individuals and communities. As such, adaptive social protection play a crucial role in building resilience and provide access to income earning opportunities as one of the human capital investment strategies so that vulnerable people do not fall deeper into poverty or to promote those vulnerable people move out of poverty. However, creating effective social protections program remain a challenge to policymakers. So I believe today's lecture will provide some insight on how such program can be designed effectively and implemented for the benefit for the larger society, especially in understanding in the context of adaptive social protections. Without further deliberating of the topic, I encourage all of you to take full advantage of today's event for networking and collaborations and embrace the spirit of intellectual curiosities that defines our communities. Before I conclude, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all who have contributed to the success of today's event, from our esteemed speakers, World Bank Group, the Department of Political Science, Public Administrations and Development Studies, our volunteers, and the dedicated members of the organizing committee. In closing, I wish all of you a stimulating and rewarding event filled with enlightening discussion, meaningful connections, and memorable moments. May we leave here inspired and energized, ready to take the challenges and opportunities that lies ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Yong Chen Chen, for the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed further this morning, will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, World Bank Country Manager for Malaysia, to deliver his speech. Please welcome.
Good morning, Professor Dr. Yon Chen Chen, Deputy Dean of Faculty Business and Economics, Professor Dr. Chandran Govindaraju, Dr. Sonia Kumari, Dr. Sharifa Muhaira Shabuddin, and friends of UM, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be here with you. The very first of what we are calling the Keynote lecture series. In the World Bank office here in KL, and we have been in KL since 2015. From the very beginning, we have hosted a team of what we call research economists. And you may not know the distinction. We have the regular economists who do the work on a policy-related matters, and then we have research economists who are involved more in the academic research, and with the view to providing insights in the long run that benefit policy decisions. And so currently we have a team of about half a dozen economists sitting in our office who are under the World Bank World Bank's chief economist for East Asia and the Pacific. And they cover the entire East Asian Pacific region in their research agenda. And so this office's initiative to start bringing prominent speakers to engage in discussions around cutting-edge academic research. The aim is to connect top economics researchers from around the world to Malaysia, strengthen research community and collaborations in Malaysia, and foster policy discussions with evidence from cutting-edge research by presenting a body of work on various topics on economic development of relevance to Malaysia. So I'm very happy to let you know that our first speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Skoufias. He's currently with the NUS in Singapore, but he spent many, many years in the World Bank, and I had a privilege of working with him at some point as well in my previous time. And today's topic is, what is it? Something about livable planet. In front of me, economic development in a livable planet. Livable planet is actually a part of the new mission statement that the World Bank Group has adopted recently. We have, for the last almost year now, a new president who came from the private sector with a dynamic idea, shaking us up, and to doing things differently, being more effective, more impactful, especially in addressing global challenges. And so with his leadership, we have adopted a new mission statement, which is the world free of poverty on a livable planet. And the livable part, of course, is very, very important. You may think of the climate challenge at first, but there are many other things. We just went through a pandemic. In many parts of the world, countries are going through conflict, and which is one of the most pernicious ways in which poverty can be worsened and entrenched. And the countries and governments are struggling to be able to manage those situations. So it is in that context, he's going to be talking to us about the concept of adaptive social protection. What is adaptive social protection? In our humble opinion, Malaysia doesn't yet have a fully functioning social protection system, okay? And so the government is trying to develop various elements of it. Currently, the Minister of Economy, Rafizi, is championing this tool called PADU. PADU is, as you know, an instrument that collects information about households so that the government can identify who needs help from the economic perspective and provide assistance such as cash transfers or some other programs. It could be job training, it could be access to healthcare. That's up to the government. Right? So using a tool like this and making benefits available according to the circumstantial needs. So for example, in 2015, I was leading a team, the World Bank team of social protection in Nepal. There was a big earthquake. And in one district, for example, 99% of the houses were destroyed. And what did the government do? The government came up with a program together with the World Bank and other donors to provide the time-bound support to help people rebuild their houses. What was the mechanism? Cash transfer. So they provided technical assistance and identified people who needed help and offered cash transfer as a means for them to rebuild their home. Something that in a while, perhaps Malaysia should also consider adopting. Just, I understand that other people will more properly introduce Dr. Skoufias. So let me just say one more thing, perhaps not directly related to the topic. I don't know if you're going to touch on it. And it's about evaluation. One of his famous things from his experience is the fact that he was a member of one of the most famous impact evaluations in the world, perhaps. And he was involved in evaluating cash transfer program, conditional cash transfer program in Mexico in the 90s. And just like you had in 2018, in Mexico, they had the change of government after 70 years of one party in power in the year 2000. And there was a concern that this government would come in and scrap programs that the previous government had in place, including good programs. In this case, as the story goes, and as I was told, that because of the rigor of the impact evaluations that demonstrated the effectiveness of this conditional cash transfer program, the incoming government was persuaded to keep it. And other subsequent government continued to keep it. And it has become one of the world best practices when it comes to poverty-targeted conditional cash transfer program. Unfortunately, the current president killed it, but that's politics, I suppose. So he has this experience, and why am I mentioning this? Because evaluation, especially rigorous impact evaluation, is unheard of in Malaysia. I've been here 2.5 years. I've never heard of one. I don't hear people talk about it. You as students of economics, I hope some of you, if you're doing micro, may want to start thinking about the value of rigorous evaluation, especially impact evaluation. It's very difficult because data access is the problem here. But unless you start demanding rigorous evaluation government programs, you'll never get there. So, you know, I don't know if you're going to touch on it, but I think it'll be a very worthwhile conversation to be had as well. And he brings wealth of experience in that topic also. Anyway, without further ado, thank you very much for hosting us in the very first of the series of our keynote lecture series. And we very much look forward to having many more opportunities like this and deepen our partnership and interactions with you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, for the speech. Ladies and gentlemen, on to the stage, please welcome Professor Dr. Vijaya Chandran, Dr. Sunya Kumari, and Professor Dr. Emmanuel Skoufias to proceed with our program tentatives. Please welcome.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see all of you here today. Before we begin, I would like to welcome all of you here at University Malaya, and we are honored to host the key lecture today. Thank you very much for coming. We also welcome Professor Emmanuel Skoufias. Thank you very much for coming, Prof. We are honored that you're here to deliver a keynote lecture, one which I think will be rather insightful, particularly to our guests and our students. Thank you, Prof. So perhaps before I hand over the floor to Professor Emmanuel, I'd like to provide some brief description about Professor's very lengthy resume. So Professor is a visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew University, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor obtained his bachelor's degree from University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota. He started his career as an assistant professor at the Pennsylvania State University and as an associate professor at the Economics Institute of University of Colorado. Then he joined the World Bank in 2004 until his retirement in 2022 as a lead economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. At the World Bank, Professor Emmanuel worked on countries in Latin America, Africa, South Asia, and East Asia Pacific. Today's keynote lecture, titled Economic Development in a Livable Planet, focuses on adaptive social protection and targeting the vulnerable. Professor, the floor is yours. You have about an hour, and then we'll open up to question and answers. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's both an honor and a privilege to be here with you. And I don't know which one. Thank you. And I'm happy to talk about adaptive social protection and targeting. This is work that, to a large extent, I have been doing for the last 20 years almost. And here's the outline of the presentation. I will talk about, provide some of the motivation and describe what is adaptive social protection and some of the challenges of ASP, or adaptive social protection programs. And of course, targeting is one of these challenges. And get into a little bit more specifics about targeting the vulnerable, as opposed to targeting the poor. There's, I will highlight what the differences are and what are the challenges of doing that, and provide some sort of applications that have been done using data, and how can adaptive social protection be financed. The main thing that I want to point out is that there's no country in the world that has actually implemented yet an adaptive social protection the way I will describe here in the PowerPoint. Lots of countries have social protection programs or components of social protection programs, and these serve a purpose, which is to protect the poor, but the goal is to eventually move towards or improve these programs to become more adaptive and more flexible. And that's what this presentation is all about, okay? So there's no country, or nobody would recommend, if you have no social protection, just go directly to adaptive social protection. That's too difficult to do, and it's probably doomed to fail. One probably has to first start building a cohesive and effective social protection program, and then start worrying about making it adaptive. So in general, I think we all agree that countries are highly vulnerable to shocks, and in particular natural disasters, and shocks arising from climate change, and other pandemic shocks. Now, overall, the graph on the left shows you that the number of natural disasters, for example, has been increasing in recent decades, and especially in typhoons, and in many countries in East Asia are more frequent and more damaging and stronger. For example, Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines caused about 6,300 deaths, an additional 2.3 million people who were not poor, but because of the disaster that took place, fell below the poverty line. Okay? And that's essentially what adaptive social protection is. Adaptive social protection is about how do you sort of make your program flexible to support these people that have been affected by shocks. This picture here is about spending on social protection in many countries. And the point of this picture is that, in general, countries spend a very small fraction of their GDP in social protection. So about half of the countries spend between 1% and 2% of their GDP in social protection. On the other hand, they spend much more on subsidies that generally cost a lot of money. Now, what are social protection programs? That's sort of a general description. Social protection programs are non-contributory programs targeted to the poor and vulnerable. And here are some examples. Unconditional cash transfer programs, conditional cash transfer programs. And again, the word here, conditional, means you have to do something in order to get the money. Like sending your children to school, or sending your children to a health center, taking your children to a health center, and then you receive the benefit of the program. That's what we mean by conditional cash transfers. Then other in-kind programs like food stamps, school feeding programs, food distribution, and other in-kind programs, public workfare programs, and fee waivers for services like health and education. So all these programs have multiple goals, and basically building a social protection system means that you try to make some coherence between these programs. okay? Usually, it's typical that every ministry of every country is instituting some programs under their purview that will that try to aim to protect or help the poor. But every ministry acts on its own, and they determine who they think is the poor or the vulnerable, if we agree on the term, and without coordinating with other ministries who also may have their own list of who are the poor and vulnerable. Building social protection program, a coherent social protection program, means you need to have all these ministries communicate with each other and create, if you like, a unique or social registry where you have a complete picture of who are the poor in the country or the vulnerable in the country, and then every ministry draws their beneficiaries from that list. To some extent, or to a large extent, Malaysia is doing that already, right? Through this PADU program, or exactly, I don't know the PADU. So now, one more sort of slide about terminology. What is social protection? And then you also hear the word social safety nets. What's the difference between social protection and social safety nets? Well, social protection is a public action that helps vulnerable people and communities manage, before or after, the risks that are posed by disease, natural disasters, loss of employment, drought, conflict, financial crisis, or economic downturns, all kinds of shocks. The key thing is that social protection protects you. That means it protects you from falling when you're affected by a shock. It catches you when you fall, and it helps you, like it gives you a rope to climb up. And that's the key aspect of the social protection. It also gives you a rope. It helps you climb up. Safety net, on the other hand, is just a net. You get affected by a shock, and the net is just there to help you, to catch you. Now, once you get caught, that's it. You're done. You didn't fall further, but the safety net doesn't do much more than that to help you climb out. So, in principle, that's the distinction between social protection and social safety net. So, many countries have social protection systems, and I mentioned that, but these are not designed in general to support the vulnerable to poverty. Most, and what I mean by vulnerable to poverty is that means also households who are not classified as poor now, but they're living on the edge, and when there's a shock, these households fall below the poverty line. These are the people that we can call non-poor, vulnerable to poverty. But in general, the term vulnerable to poverty refers to the current poor and to those who live a precarious life and close to the poverty line and possible to drop below the poverty line. So the incidence of economic shocks, natural disasters, and for example, the COVID pandemic, and the increasing frequency of extreme weather events associated with climate change necessitate, in general, strengthening social protection programs to become adaptive. Of course, this is not something that you can do overnight. It's something that you have to sort of build the foundations early on by having strong social protection programs, and then eventually moving to adaptive social protection programs. Now, so adaptive social protection programs are the ultimate aim. Do countries have adaptive social protection programs yet? No. But you want to, ideally countries want to move in that direction, yeah? So what are adaptive social protection programs? So these are programs that can be easily scaled up in response to shocks. And then I have a list of shocks here, a menu, big menu of shocks. Also, adaptive social protection programs are programs that play a stronger insurance role. So right now, most social protection programs in most countries serve as instruments of income redistribution or for giving incentives to poor households to invest in the human capital of their children. The insurance role of social protection requires a flexible budget that can be scaled up rapidly to meet these unanticipated circumstances when you have shocks, for example. Another sort of key feature of the adaptive social protection program is that these programs are targeted to the vulnerable households, not just to the chronic poor. All right, so now I'm beginning to make the distinction between vulnerable and poor, and I'll get to that in more detail later. Also, the adaptive social protection programs, like regular social protection programs, are programs that are supposed and should exploit synergies across different sectors. For example, the conditional cash transfer programs are a very good basis for sort of promoting collaboration between the health ministry, education ministry, and nutrition ministry. If you didn't have a conditional cash transfer program, each ministry would be doing its own things without any regard about what the others are doing. And also these programs, the adaptive social protection programs, can also be used to provide incentives for adaptation. If agriculture is a big thing in the country, increase agricultural productivity, and also promote resiliency to climatic shocks. Now, of course, this is the ideal of what an adaptive social protection program is. There are challenges, important challenges to building adaptive social protection programs. And some of these challenges are also common to just building social protection programs, period. It's not only adaptive. But in any case, in this particular case, I'm talking about adaptive social protection programs. And a big challenge is the fiscal space. The fiscal space is constrained, and there are many pressures to the government budgets. For adaptive social protection programs to play an insurance role, you need to have counter-cyclical social expenditures. That means the government or the program needs to be spending more money when the economy is bad, the economy is doing bad. But usually when the economy is doing bad, the revenues of the government are low because people don't have income. They're unemployed, they don't pay taxes. So in general, the revenue of the government is low. But that's exactly the period that the government needs to be spending more money to help people. So fiscal space is a problem. The other important sort of or constraining factor is before you can do adaptive social protection, you need to have social protection, or you need to have some programs that are in place before an event or a shock takes place. So you need to have in place contingent funding prior to the shock, and in general, you need to have fairly well-functioning simple social protection programs before they can become adaptive social protection programs. The other, again, targeting is a challenge. Right now, most of the social protection programs in most countries, and I think Malaysia included, is that existing systems are geared to targeting the chronic poor, or in general, the households that are poor. But the point is that when there is a crisis, the pool of who is poor becomes much bigger because lots of households fall below the poverty line. In principle, the government should have, or the program should have a better picture or a better sense of who is, of which households are more likely to fall below the poverty line in the event of a shock. And you need to have that picture or that sense before the shock hits. You don't want to wait after the shock and then say, okay, who needs help? You should know, the government or the program operators should know in advance who are the vulnerable to poverty in the event of a shock. And essentially, this is what I'm going to be talking about a little bit further down. All right, identifying the vulnerable to poverty ex ante, or before the shock happens. And in general, in order to build an adaptive social protection program, it's not an easy process. It takes time. It takes a lot of trial and error, and you need to have adequate administrative structures to help people. And on top of that, you need to have the institutions that have the administrative capacity and institutions that coordinate within the government. You don't have the coordination within the government, adaptive social protection and social protection in general will not be very effective, or it will be wasteful. So this is a visual sort of representation of how an adaptive social protection program works and what targeting of the vulnerable to poverty does. The gray square there is the regular conditional cash transfer program, for example, which many countries have, which is a program that is targeted to the chronic poor. Right? The conditional cash transfer program usually gives money to the people that are identified as poor, and that sort of forms the basis of a social protection program. Now, what happens in the event of a shock or in the event of a crisis? Well, in the event of a shock or a crisis, what the government can do or what the program can do is the people who are benefiting already from the program, you can give them more money, right? That's what you call a vertical expansion of the program. So you can give them additional grants or higher grants. The thing that is difficult is how can you let new people into the program when there's a crisis, right? How do you identify who are you going to let into the program? Lots of people are going to be affected, but do you let everybody in? Do you you need to have some criterion, otherwise it becomes a very very expensive proposition. And that's where targeting the vulnerable becomes very useful. When you have a criterion of who is vulnerable to poverty, it allows you, before the crisis takes place, it allows you to identify or to have some filter through which you can let people into the program and provide benefits. So the rest that I'm going to talk about is sort of work that I've been doing over the years. These are some of the references. And in order to understand, the remaining, it's important to have a clear understanding of what's between poverty and vulnerability. I already hinted about this, but let's go through this again. Poverty is about being poor today. Usually, how do you identify poverty? Well, you do a household survey. You ask people how much they consume or what income they have. So either income or consumption or assets. You use this as criteria to identify the welfare status of the household, and then you have a poverty line, and then you decide, okay, is this household below the poverty line? Yes or no? If it's yes, the household is poor. They become eligible for the program, right? So that's what poverty is about. It's about, essentially, it's about your welfare or your welfare at the time of the survey, right? Now, if you do a survey at another point in time, you're not necessarily going to find the same households as poor. Of course, the households that are chronically poor are always going to be identified as poor, but there's a lot of movement, especially for those who are close to the poverty line, in and out of poverty. So But in general, most of the social protection programs, when they're not adaptive, they're usually targeted to the poor based on poverty as I just described it. Yeah, in very simple terms. So the headcount rate, for example, the poverty rate is the fraction of people in the population who have whose consumption is or income is less than the poverty line. End of story. And that's what conditional cash transfer programs do. They use this criterion. They say, okay, you guys are going to be, based on my survey, you guys are below the poverty line. You're eligible for the program. Now, 5 years later, the story may be very different. You know, if there's shocks, some households would deserve the benefits, and some who are already beneficiaries may need to exit the program. What's vulnerability? Vulnerability is about the potential of being poor now or within a certain time interval in the future. So it's more of a forward-looking measure. One can be poor tomorrow, but not poor today. So vulnerability is a broader concept, and it includes the households in general who are poor now, all right, for the most part. So vulnerability rate is the fraction of the people in the population that have, for example, the probability of being poor within a fixed time interval, for example, greater than a threshold. Let's say 50% of the time they have a probability more than 50% of being poor, falling below the poverty line in the event of a shock. So the best way to understand, or the simple way of understanding vulnerability is that it consists of two components. One is the average level of welfare or consumption across different states of the world, and the variability of consumption across different states of the world. So whereas poverty only looks at consumption at one point in time, vulnerability, you can think of it as looking at average consumption across many different points in time, and also variability of consumption across many different points in time. And in general, households may differ based on the mean level of their consumption or based on the variance. They may have the same mean, but very different variance. Let me explain what I mean by that. Here's vulnerability to poverty. The red squares are the mean sort of level of income or the mean level of consumption a household has in many different points in time. Okay? And in this particular picture, the vertical line is the poverty line. So in this particular picture, you have 10 households, and of these 10 households, 4 households on average, or their consumption on average, or their welfare on average is below the poverty line. You can see the red square is below the poverty line. Yeah? But in this picture, I've also drawn this whisker, this horizontal line around the mean. This is the variance of the consumption or the welfare measure of the household. So some households, their income varies from day to day or from month to month. And so some households has a big variance, and some households have low variance around the mean. All right? For example, a street seller, some days they sell good. When it rains, nobody wants to buy anything, so their income is low. So on average, their variance, of their income is determined by these factors. And on average, that household their consumption may be below the poverty line. So that would be what you call a chronically poor household. So here in this particular example, as I said, there's 4 chronically poor households because their average consumption is below the poverty line. But there are other households here. There's another 6 households, some of which may actually fall below the poverty line. Who are these households? Well, look at household B, labeled as B. Household B has a variance of income, but this variance of their welfare or consumption never goes below the poverty line. Okay? So this household is not vulnerable to poverty. But then look at household C. Household C, they have a variance of their income over time, but in some cases, their income may fall below the poverty line, right? So that household is vulnerable to poverty, even though on average, this household is above the poverty line, right? So that's sort of the distinction between a household vulnerable to poverty versus a household that is not vulnerable to poverty. Look at household E. Household E here is above the poverty line on average, right? Their red square or the orange square is above the poverty line, but they also have very small variance. What type of household has a very small variance of their income? Well, a civil servant, right? The civil servant gets a salary every day. Their income doesn't vary. It doesn't depend very much on what they do. They get a salary no matter what. COVID comes in, they get the same salary. COVID comes out, they get the same salary. So they have a very low variance, even though they may be above the poverty line. So this household here, household E, is not vulnerable to poverty. On the other hand, household F, which is more or less the same income on average, or same consumption on average, they have a greater variance of consumption, and they can fall below the poverty line sometimes. Okay, so that household F is vulnerable to poverty, whereas household E is not vulnerable to poverty. So that's essentially the visual representation of what's the difference between who is vulnerable to poverty and who is not vulnerable to poverty, based on the mean and the variance of their consumption or welfare or income. All right. Of course, it is very difficult to know the mean and the variance of an income of a household. You can do a survey to try to solicit this kind of information, or you can observe households at different points in time, but then you need to have lots of these observations of households at different points in time to get a credible or reliable measure of the variance and measure of the income of the household. Most longitudinal or panel surveys, most longitudinal or panel surveys usually have 3-4 observations over time of the same household. These are not enough to allow you to sort of get an estimate of the variance of the income of a household. Well, so we need to use statistical methods that are and certain set of assumptions in order to be able to estimate the variance of the household over time. I'm not going to get into that. It's sort of a technical issue, but that's the idea about the sort of main idea about vulnerability. You know, you want to know the average income of the household in many states of the world, in good times, bad times, average times, and you want to estimate the mean and the variance. Now, what do most programs or some programs do in practice when they want to talk about the vulnerable? Because what I just described is quite complicated, right? It needs a lot of data. What most programs do is here's for example, a poverty line, and here's 3 households that are classified as poor, and then you have 7 households that are above the poverty line, right? Some programs say, well, we can move the poverty line to the right a little bit, increase the poverty line, and let's say 1.5 times the poverty line. And then anybody who falls between the poverty line and this new poverty line that I just described, we'll call them vulnerable. Okay? That's how most programs, for example, operationalize or put in practice the idea of vulnerability. What essentially they do is they look at current poverty, and then they say, well, I know that some people may fall below the poverty line in the event of a shock. Who are these people? Well, I don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the poverty line a little bit to the right, and anybody who is in there, we can call them vulnerable. Actually, that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad way of doing this, except that it's kind of blind. As I here, I have two households that are below, that are vulnerable, right, to falling below the poverty line. But as I just showed you earlier, we have household E and household F, and household E is not vulnerable to poverty, and household F is vulnerable to poverty. So basically, half of the households, based on the targeting method that I'm talking about, are vulnerable to poverty, based on if you could do this, whereas with the previous way of just moving the poverty line, all the households, 100% of the households between the two poverty lines would be vulnerable. Well, obviously, that has very important budget implications. Very important budget implications. With targeting the vulnerable, half of the people are considered as vulnerable. With this method, everybody between the two poverty lines is considered as vulnerable. So budget-wise, that means dramatic differences. How much money you need if you are concerned about the vulnerable to poverty, or if you want to do an adaptive social protection program. Okay, so hopefully that has provided some strong justification of why we need to target the vulnerable and not just move the poverty line to the right. If I am correct, one way of understanding what Malaysia is doing is doing this thing. They're moving Malaysia is moving the poverty line to the right and says, well, I have a B40 poverty line, and I'm covering a good chunk of the population, so I'm including the vulnerable. Well, yeah, but that has dramatic budgetary implications. Okay, now, so it's not only Malaysia that does this, by the way. It's also Indonesia does the same thing. So it's common to do that because, I mean, as I said, it makes sense that yes, people above the poverty line but close to it are vulnerable. But then again, it has major budgetary implications. That if you do let's say a universal social protection program, universal social protection program doesn't mean that you're going to give money to everybody. It just means that you're going to give money to those who need it. And who are those who need it? Well, those who need it are household F, but not household E, right? Because household E will never fall below the poverty line. He's a civil servant, always gets a salary. Household F, they have big variability of their income, so they will fall on the poverty line. So you want to give them the benefits of the program. All right, so so that's I think that's what I wanted to sort of say in terms of distinguishing between targeting based on poverty and targeting based on vulnerability to poverty. Now I'm going to briefly describe, not without getting into technical details, some of the methods of estimating vulnerability to poverty the way I described it, with estimating the mean and the variance of consumption. So there's two basic approaches. One is what you call the multi-level approach, and the other one is simulation approach. Multi-level approach is you know, I don't want to mislead anybody. Multi-level approach has to do with a statistical method, which is called the hierarchical method in estimating models. Yeah, which means that you have correlation of the error terms or behavior at different levels. You have correlation among households within a certain village, for example, in terms of their preferences, in terms of their, so multi-level means that. It's a hierarchical, hierarchical approach to estimation. And then there's what you call the simulation approach. What are the two features of these two approaches? Basically, both approaches estimate the probability that a household can fall below the poverty line. And then they choose a poverty threshold above which a household is, they choose a probability threshold above which a household is defined as vulnerable to poverty. So now both of these methods rely on cross-sectional data, which is, you know, both an advantage and a shortcoming of the data. In principle, as I said, we need to really estimate the variance of an income of a household. You want to observe that household in many different points in time and get their income and then calculate the mean and the variance of their income. But that's very expensive and very difficult to do. So what you do is you use statistical methods to sort of substitute for this lack of data by using basically information on other households. That's what we mean by using cross-sectional data to estimate the mean and the variance of a household. And the other advantage of these two approaches, and that's a common feature, is that they can distinguish between what you call the chronic poor and the non-poor vulnerable to poverty. Now, what are their differences? Well, the key difference is how they predict future consumption. Basically, in the multi-level approach, you do not use any information on specific shocks. You only, shocks can be what we call aggregate shocks or idiosyncratic shocks. Idiosyncratic shock is a fancy term for did you get sick or not, for example. That's an idiosyncratic shock. An aggregate shock is a shock that affects everybody in a community or in a country. COVID is an aggregate shock. So what this approach, this multi-level approach does, basically it decomposes the error term of a regression model into a covariate or community level shock and an idiosyncratic shock. That's why it's called multi-level or hierarchical approach. Again, it's a statistical approach. The simulation approach is basically more data demanding. It uses concrete information on the incidence and intensity of aggregate level shocks and idiosyncratic shocks. So for example, if one wants to apply the simulation approach to estimating vulnerability to poverty, you put consumption or welfare on the left-hand side of a regression model, and on the right-hand side, you put, did you experience very, let's say, extreme rainfall or extreme temperature? Did did anybody in your family get COVID? These are shocks that are basically idiosyncratic shocks, and some of them can be aggregate shock. Is the economy in a recession? When the economy is in a recession, that's an aggregate shock. Everybody gets affected more or less by. So this approach uses all these kinds of information in the regression model, and of course it offers the advantage that you know under what kind of shocks households may become, their consumption may be affected, or their welfare may be affected. Now, again, these are some of the finer details, but I'll just give you a sense of what one can get from the multi-level approach versus the simulation approach. From the multi-level approach, there's an operational advantage. As I said, it's less demanding in terms of data, but stronger in terms of assumptions that you make. And ability to, you're able to decompose vulnerability in different regions of the country based on its source. You can decompose vulnerability based on, let's say, chronic poverty or versus risk-induced vulnerability. Or you can decompose vulnerability based on, I didn't do anything. Or you can do covariate versus idiosyncratic. You can decompose vulnerability in these two sources. Now that is useful because if one does this kind of analysis, it helps you sort of tailor what kind of programs would be more appropriate for different groups of people or for different regions. For example, if in a region you find that most of the vulnerability is because of poverty reasons, then you want to do social assistance type of programs in that region, right? Social assistance programs means cash transfer type of programs. On the other hand, if a lot of the vulnerability in a certain area is because of shocks, or it's risk-induced, so to speak, then you want to have social insurance type of programs and not only social assistance programs. So, and for that, we built a vulnerability toolkit at the World Bank that people can apply to do these kinds of decompositions or diagnostics. Here, for example, this is some work we've done in Africa. What we find is if you were to just look at vulnerability to poverty versus poverty, what you see is that in most countries, of course, vulnerability rate is greater than the poverty rate, right? And of course it should be, because vulnerability is the poor plus those who may become poor. So in general, vulnerability rate is higher. So relying on the poverty status of households misses about 1/3 of the population vulnerable to poverty. Right? So that's a useful piece of information to have. Again, mind you, all these conclusions that we're getting are based on a statistical model with assumptions, right? And of course, anybody or everybody can criticize the assumptions and that go into building these models, but that's life. We don't have the alternative or the ideal, which is many repeated observations of households over time. So that allows us to get the mean and the variance of income. And also the other sort of useful thing that one gets is that you can not only do that at the national level, but you can do it within different regions within a country, and different regions may need different types of programs. Now, again, in countries or regions where poverty-induced vulnerability is predominant, there's a need to prioritize policies strengthening social assistance and cash transfer programs. For example, conditional cash transfer programs. In countries or regions where risk-induced vulnerability is predominant, there's a need to prioritize policies such as increasing the availability of social insurance mechanisms that help households cope and recover from the negative shocks. And of course, within a country, there's a lot of variability across regions. Here in this example, you look at Ethiopia, rural areas, urban areas. In the rural areas, vulnerability is primarily risk-induced. In the urban areas, risk-induced vulnerability is not as strong. On the other hand, in Niger, vulnerability is primarily poverty-induced, and in urban areas, it's risk-induced. This picture here shows you the, you can combine these methods with what we call poverty mapping methods or vulnerability mapping methods, and get a sense of where the poor households are located and where the vulnerable to poverty households may be located. So the green map on the left-hand side shows you that the poor households are primarily in the municipalities that are dark green there, all right? On the other hand, if you were to focus on risk-induced vulnerability, you see that the dark red municipalities are different than the poverty municipalities, where poverty is concentrated. So clearly, if you were to expand programs, you would do different kinds of programs in these dark red municipalities than in the dark green municipalities. Because in the dark green municipalities, you basically have poverty as the main, lack of assets as the main source of vulnerability, whereas in the dark red municipalities, you have households being primarily impacted by shocks and falling into poverty line because of shocks. All right, now the simulation approach essentially uses information about welfare and specific information about the shock. And we also did this exercise in the Philippines where we use the intensity of a typhoon, or the wind speed, as a measure of the shock of the household. And we carried out the analysis, and we see that these two maps here tell you where the poor are located, and this is where the program, a conditional cash transfer program, primarily operates, and where the people become poor as a consequence of the typhoons. All right, and as you can see, people falling below the poverty line in the areas which are not necessarily covered by the program, by the conditional cash transfer program. The dark red on the picture, on the map on the right, is the areas that are mostly affected because of the typhoon. So a conditional cash transfer program which focuses on the poor, well, it helps the poor, but it's not particularly well equipped to cover the households that are being affected by the typhoon. So if they had targeting based on vulnerability, they could use this map, for example, and try to come up with mechanisms that allow households in these regions up on the right there to enter into the conditional cash transfer program that Philippines has, which is called 4P, by the way. Okay. So there's another potential application of this targeting approach, is that you can get what you call the exceedance probability curves, which is what insurance companies use to determine how much money they need to have available in the event of a disaster. All right, so these are very technical methods, but basically the exceedance probability, these vulnerability curves here show you on the vertical axis is what's the percentage point change in the poverty rate with for example, different intensities of rainfall. So you can get almost a menu, right? That if the rainfall is good, for example, this tells you the poverty rate goes down by 1%, right? But if rainfall is poor, poverty rate will increase by 2 or 3 percentage points. It depends on the intensity of the rainfall, how far the rainfall deviates from the normal, from the average. So these are what you call the exceedance probability curves that have been that are common in the insurance industry, and we try to estimate that for. And ideally, someday the World Bank will also use these kinds of curves, because these kinds of curves tell you what's the poverty impact of different intensities of the disaster, right? And of course, if the natural disaster is very intense, very high, this can tell you, okay, poverty rate will increase 3%, for example. That means you need so much more money to have available to transfer to the affected populations. All right, so with this, I'm just going to conclude now. So in general, the decision to support the vulnerable and the threshold you use to determine who is vulnerable to poverty are very intimately connected with how much budgetary resources you have available, and also, what is the concern of the government and the political economy sort of considerations involved in the use of scarce financial resources to support households that are far from the higher parts of the welfare distribution. If the government has unlimited amount of money, then there's no point in being concerned about the vulnerable, right? And you just make a universal social protection program that not universal social protection, but you include everybody into the program, and you provide benefit irrespective of whether they need it or not. End of story. You don't need to worry about targeting the vulnerable. The point is that resources are limited, and you need to worry how to use these resources efficiently, and ideally provide these resources to the households that need it the most. And then, of course, there's a subjective value involved. What does it mean that this household needs it more than this other household? That is a political decision that needs to be made, and different countries make different decisions. Finally, how can adaptive social protection be financed? Well, again, here Malaysia is doing the right thing. Most of the countries, including Malaysia, are financing the building of social protection programs through removal of subsidies, fuel subsidies, or food subsidies, or other sort of subsidies that cost a lot of money. They have very high leakage, these kinds of programs. They go to people who don't need it necessarily. A lot of the rich households driving expensive cars benefit from fuel subsidies. Do they need a fuel subsidy? Probably not. So that's not so if you remove the fuel subsidy, that releases a lot of resources for the government budget, and you can use some of these resources to maybe all, but most of the cases, some of these resources to build a social protection program, better targeted towards the poor, and maybe someday making it an adaptive social protection program that makes it flexible and allows you to expand or contract coverage as the needs require. So with that, I will stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the very, very insightful lecture. Perhaps I'll pass the floor over to Prof. Chandran to start us off with the moderating session, and then we'll take it from there. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sonia. I think it's a very insightful kind of talk today. We have learned a lot, Prof. Emmanuel. Basically, you have started off with what is social protection and what is the difference between social protection and also safety net. And then you went into talking about the adaptive concept of social protection, the nature that it requires a lot of dynamic engagement by institutions and so on. And also, I mean, the key in the talk is the challenges that he has presented, whereby budget constraint and other kind of challenges are very pertinent in terms of how do you design the social protection programs and so forth. Yeah. So I think I believe that a lot of audience are keen to ask questions. Let me start the ball rolling by asking one question first. Prof. Emmanuel, you have done a lot of work in the past, and what do you think about this cash transfer as compared to conditional cash transfer, which is more effective in that sense? Because sometimes we do have trade-off in terms of giving cash to individuals which are not utilized to the purpose that it was given to. So in your opinion, what do you think about these two approaches?
Yeah, I think the idea of conditional cash transfers is good, and it makes sense, but in terms of enforcing it sort of involves additional costs, right? For conditional cash transfer programs, you need to make sure that people satisfy the conditions, which is costly. You know, you need to have teachers fill out attendance forms, and then these attendance forms need to be sent to the center of the central offices of the program, who decide, you know, whether a specific student attended regularly the class, or vice versa for the health center visits. You know, you need to have records from the health centers. So all these conditions require, you know, they have logistical issues and costs involved. On the other hand, we know that when there's conditions, households try to satisfy these conditions so that they can get the benefit. So on the other hand, the empirical evidence is that unconditional cash transfer programs, you know, sometimes have the same effect as conditional cash transfer programs, and they don't have some of the costs. But there's never a clear answer to say that one is better than the other. It depends on the context. It depends on the country. It depends on the set of circumstances. So, and since I'm a data-driven person, I would say, well, you can choose which one is more appropriate for your context. Yeah, but the data we have available today doesn't give you a clear answer whether conditional or unconditional is better.
All right, thank you very much. Shall I open the floor for questions? Yep. There's a mic there.
There's a mic.
Hi, thanks so much for that interesting talk. I was just kind of wondering about the comparison you were making between moving the poverty line out compared to targeting through this kind of whatever exercise you might want to do. I'm sure you must have conducted some kind of validations of your methods, right? Taking countries which have multiple rounds of data, panel data, to see if you end up doing a naive movement of the line, and then say you identify, and then you use one of your suggested targeting methods and identify the number of people who would be classified as vulnerable, come up with a budget share so that you exactly move your poverty line that much that you balance your budgets with both the methods, right? How much better does targeting do relative to that would be my first question. And connected to that on a larger scale, thinking about, say, contexts such as India, where some forms of social programs have been more successful than others, such as, say, food for work programs that are self-selecting rather than targeting, right? So have you something to say about what more thought being put into self-selecting mechanisms that could kind of overcome this kind of elite opposition to such programs? They're available to everyone so that, there's no targeting per se, resources are not involved, and maybe thinking along those lines could have some returns to policy in some sense.
Thank you. So you must be an academic. I would love to do what you just said, but there's no data really. The only country that I know of that one could do this exercise is India, where there's the pyramid survey, I think it's called. But I have not been able to access this survey because this survey gives you have at least 15 observations for household across time, which allows you to do this, properly estimate the variance and the mean of consumption. But I have not been able to access this survey. But what you're suggesting is exactly sort of what one should do, and I would love to do this, but just give me the data. Like Archimedes said, give me a place to stand and I will move the world for you. But I don't have a place to stand. Regarding your second question, yeah, the self-selection, is a very effective mechanism which allows you to avoid, if you like, all this exercise about targeting. But this is really an ex post mechanism, right? It works well, but after the disaster happens, you tell people, look, we're going to have a public works program. If you need it, you come and get it. But Okay. Well, I have a different take on your point. First of all, I think the focus on inclusion and exclusion errors is actually misplaced in many, not only in Malaysia, but in many countries. Again, looking at it from an academic point of view, what matters for a society is that you give money, more money to people who are far below the poverty line, or you basically, when you want to do a social welfare function, you want to give more weight to people who are very far below the poverty line, and that weight decreases the closer you get to the poverty line, and it doesn't stop and become zero right after the poverty line. It should continue, and this weight would keep decreasing as you move up to the richest person and become zero, right? So you want to have a continuous weight that that gives more weight to the very poor and less weight as you move up the income distribution. The focus about inclusion and exclusion errors is a very strange social welfare function. It's a welfare function that says, well, right up to the poverty line, you're going to get the weight, and if you are one ringgit above the poverty line, you're going to get zero. You're not worth anything, right? And that's true for that person as well as true for the person at the top of the income distribution. So inclusion and exclusion errors are very strange measures, but a lot of people don't sort of take a step back to think about, well, what exactly are we doing when we're looking at inclusion and exclusion error? Because they have an intuitive appeal. That's the reason everybody's looking at inclusion and exclusion errors. The same thing about poverty. Everybody wants to know that poverty headcount rate, but then we all know that the poverty headcount rate is not a good measure of poverty. It's not, because it treats somebody right below the poverty line the same way as somebody who is destitute, has nothing. And we know that one should do the poverty gap or should do the P2, poverty, severity of poverty measure. But again, we don't do it because headcount rate is a nice number. We all understand it. 50% or 10% is the poverty rate, and there's a lot of arguments in every country about, oh, did the poverty rate go up or did it go down? I think it's futile, if you ask me, to be thinking about this in this manner. So inclusion and exclusion errors would be better served if you have a continuous social welfare function that allows you to also include into your estimate those who are above the poverty line. And what you see is that a lot of the targeting errors that, in terms of exclusion or inclusion, actually are errors that occur very close to the poverty line. So a lot of the mistakes that are happening with targeting, with all these methods that I described, are usually mistakes that are happening below and above the poverty line, which actually, if you have a sensible social welfare function, it's not such a terrible thing. But when you only focus on inclusion and exclusion error based on the traditional way of looking at inclusion and exclusion errors, then you get this very, very strict, very strong sort of conditions that people get very upset about. Oh, inclusion error is too low, and exclusion error is too high, etc. So that's my angle. That if you have a more sensible social welfare function, then the targeting errors actually are not so bad, no matter what measure you use: income, consumption, self-reported consumption. So that also addresses your point about people manipulate answers in the surveys. Well, we have an analysis, and it's one of the references that we have, is that whether you use perfect consumption measure or whether you use self-reported food consumption, for example, which people may understate or may overstate, for whatever advantage they may see, The targeting errors, again, are focusing around the poverty line, and the social welfare loss with targeting errors is actually very small. Well, we did that, I think in our case was Mexico. But again, this is an academic exercise. It's not a program-specific type of measure of exclusion or inclusion errors. Yeah, it's what if we had a social welfare function that is a continuous social welfare function that weighs or gives appropriate weight to everybody in the income distribution, and this weight decreases as you become richer in the distribution. So, and we have a number of countries that I think other countries that no, it's only one country, in Mexico. Yeah.
Right. Can we take the next one?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for the talk just now. It was very insightful. So after hearing your talk, something like that, I think there's a question in my mind is that in your perspective, do you think that actually like private sector or like corporate something like that can actually play an important role in the adaptive or social program, especially after? Because I think that sometimes I think other than governments, when they have like limited resource something like that, I think that there might other like parties like maybe private sectors like corporates, they can also be in part role. So just want to listen to your opinion on it. And if you agree with it, right? So just want to know how is it able for the private sectors that they can do to make it more efficient and continuous in ensuring that the ASP, that is social program, can be more efficient and can be executed out for those that helps to elevate the poverty and vulnerability rate. Thank you very much.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So to introduce myself, I'm Fang. The year 2 of economics students over here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll talk about the role of the private sector in providing insurance to various shocks. There are the so-called index-based insurance programs that various private sectors or various sort of organizations offer that basically, for example, allow farmers or livestock producers to buy insurance, and you use an index like the value of rainfall, the rainfall in a specific point in time, or temperature in some cases. Once the temperature hits a threshold or goes above a threshold or below a certain threshold, the insurance, everybody who has that insurance gets the benefit. So it's it's an index that the value of the index falls below a certain threshold, you get the insurance. It is possible, there's been a lot of insurance schemes of this sort. The problem is that for whatever reason, households or farmers in developing countries don't buy these insurance products. We still don't know why. That the government can try to subsidize or provide incentives or pay some of the cost of this insurance to farmers, but to date, as far as I know, there has not been very much success in trying to get people to buy this insurance, and therefore the private sector is sort of withdrawing slowly from offering these kinds of products. So it falls in the hands of the government to actually provide this insurance through social protection, whether we like it or not.
Right. We go here first. Yep.
Okay, I'm Izatina from UKM. Okay, I just want to ask, you have a lot of experience on social protection from other countries, right? So right now, Malaysia is trying to pull back its subsidies and also increase its social protection. So back to the question before. So the reason of why you having like absolute value in terms of poverty line, as opposed to your suggestion, like having some sort of probabilistic or even like deterministic kind of way in determining poverty line, like how would you sell that idea to the public, the one that is resisting to have their subsidy pool? Because right now there's this political economy of it, like you need to take out the subsidy, but then people do not want it. Okay, so how will you sell that? Because right now, if I understand, the one that fill in a lot of all this PADU registry, so those who do not fill in the form are those who feel they are very far away from or even above the B40 threshold. So in the public, they already have a figure. So how will you sell your idea of this vulnerable targeting? Okay, so thank you.
Well, it's a hard sell. I mean, this is a political economy issue. The people far above the poverty line usually are the ones with more money, more political influence, and therefore more political say. So it is hard in that context for a government to do a radical change in how, removal of the subsidy. That is always a problem associated with subsidies, removals. Yeah, there's always the people who gain from these subsidies the most, and usually these are the richest people, are the ones who have the strongest voice and political power. So it's up to the government to see whether the government wants to, how committed the government is to sort of policy change of this sort, the removal of the subsidy and the institution of a conditional cash transfer program. So a lot of it is also communication strategy, how what kind of what is and how carefully crafted that message is. I mean, from my experience in the case of Mexico, now that's 20 years ago, but what the government of Mexico at the time, in 1998, Mexico was ruled by this party called the PRI, the Institutionalized Revolution Party of Mexico. They were governing the country for 70 years. They were essentially, the way anti-poverty policy was carried out was they were giving to the municipality leaders the budget. And of course, the municipality leaders are usually people from the same party. If you're not from the same party, you don't get the budget. So that's how poverty was practiced. Poverty alleviation was practiced. After 70 years, it became clear that that people were getting tired of this kind of practice because it wasn't leading to anything substantial. It wasn't anything. So the government was fearing that they're going to be losing the elections. So they wanted to show that they are committed to a new way, a radical way of doing things. So that's how the removal of the subsidy came about, and that's how the conditional cash transfer program was conceived, that we are going to remove the subsidy, we are going to get the budget from the removal of the subsidy, and now we're not going to give the money to the municipality leaders, to our friends. We're going to give the money directly to the households that we, based on our methods, we decide are poor. That's a radical change. And of course, there was a lot of opposition. There was a lot of opposition to this radical change of doing anti-poverty policy. But it was the survival of the party that was sort of motivating this kind of policy, yeah? So whatever rich people were benefiting from this, the government was saying, be quiet or else we're going to lose the elections. We need to do something to show that we are changing our practices. So there was a commitment in that case from the point of the government to do this. Is Malaysia the same case or similar to this? I don't know. You decide.
A quick one, sir. I'm Terry. I'm the student from Dr. Sonia, actually. I'm Dr. Sonia's student. So my question lies here, which is, we know that Malaysia are far way ahead from this. We are a very unique country where we supported the majority because of maybe how democracy will house certain political agenda that comes in. But today we are seeing a culture of dependency towards the government initiatives. So today I'm asking here, which is, how much extent towards this dependency would lie, and how are we actually encouraging self-sufficient rakyat or the people in actually making sure they're able to climb above. What we're seeing today also, there are some initiatives being done. We have KL20 Summit where encourage startups to be started, and certain ministry, I think Ministry of Economy has started subsidizing in all these small businesses with 1,000 ringgit like that to start their own business. While there are some good cases where they reach 20,000, but we are seeing today that Malaysia are far beyond all these lines. And what's concerning here is the culture of dependency. So today, the question lies here, which is, we have so many initiatives coming in, and it all actually encourages dependency rather than the self-independence and self-sufficient. So to what extent are Malaysians doing on that? Yeah, thank you.
Again, I don't know Malaysia well enough to be able to say about dependency in the case of Malaysia, but dependency is always an argument used by the opposition of any kind of reform, or basically any kind of reform that aims at giving transfers to the poor households. That's always in every country. You always have this argument that, oh, if we give money to the poor, that leads to dependency. A lot of work, research has been done to analyze, do these cash transfers lead to dependency? Do they make people lazy? Do they work less? The evidence is, and that's a lot of even randomized control trials, is that, at least from other countries, no, transfers do not lead to dependency. Partly because transfers are not that big. If we were to give you, a large income, yes, I would understand that. That would lead to dependency. But these transfers are 10%, 15% of somebody's income. So they're not going to change your life dramatically so that you just, kick your feet up and take it easy. So I would say, at least from other countries, there's no evidence of dependency. Now, maybe that's the case in Malaysia. I don't really know, but from other countries, no.
Are we okay in time? Yeah, we can take one more question, so there are too many. Okay, make your question very short, yeah?
Hello, hi. Good morning. Up here. Okay, my name is Hafizi from Khazanah Research Institute. I have two questions. Number one is I understand that you earlier in your presentation you shared about case in Philippines. My question is that given the dynamic of vulnerability criteria and also limited fiscal capability, what will be other countries' best practices or policy to identify the vulnerable group, especially risk-induced vulnerable? That's number one. Number two is that earlier in your chart you shared about Group E and Group F. Group E, you mentioned that it is far from vulnerable, and Group F is more closer to vulnerable. So my question is that can preventive measure also be considered as adaptive social protection program? Preventive measure for this context is that initiative that being put in order to prevent certain group from fall into below poverty line you mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Okay, the first part of your question. Wait, I lost it now.
Can you mention what is the first question?
The first question is what are the most practical or the best policy or measures for risk-induced vulnerable, to identify risk-induced vulnerable?
Well, as I said, there's no country that has implemented yet what I talk about is adaptive social protection, yeah? And no country that is targeting the vulnerable the way I've explained in this PowerPoint. We are doing all these exercises sort of to show to the current sort of program, like a conditional cash transfer program in the Philippines, that look, right now you are focusing on the poor, but there are, you know, when there's a disaster happens, the people who are mostly affected are not the people that you are covering. There's other people in other areas, and you need to think about how to include these people into your program. And basically, by the way, here's a way that you could use, if you like, to identify who are these vulnerable that you could include into your program if you had the budget. Yeah, so that's the sort of the purpose of this exercise. There's no country that is doing what I'm doing. But as I said, this is eventually where countries need to be moving in an idea, you know, over time, because shocks are getting more frequent. With climate change, you get a lot of variability, and so programs need to become more dynamic in terms of who they include and who they leave out in terms of their coverage. The only sort of way that adaptive social protection has been implemented is the one that I showed you with the other in Indonesia, for example, where you have where you simply move the poverty line above the by multiple, let's say 1.5 times the poverty line, and then you say everybody inside that range is vulnerable and possibly eligible for benefits in the event of a crisis. But if you do that, and that also happened in Indonesia, it requires a very big budget because that's a very large chunk of the population. So it hasn't, you know, either you take a fixed budget and you divide it by a very big number of people, and people get a trivial amount of money, or you focus your targeting and then you give a more substantial transfer to these fewer households. The second thing I just said has not happened yet. What has happened is basically a limited budget that exists is given to many people, and that doesn't really do much to anyone. So that's the first part of the question. The second part, what was the second part again?
The second part is that on the preventive measure, prevent people from falling down from fall below the poverty line. Is that part of ASP?
Sorry, a lot of the investments in infrastructure, in the investments in small and medium enterprises, and investments in infrastructure basically would be useful for preventing households from falling below the poverty line. Also, business training and sort of ensuring that households, you know, practice their business in a more profitable way or a more efficient way. These are ways that allow mitigate the impacts of these shocks from and preventing households from falling below the poverty line. Right? There's also, once you fall below the poverty line, you are given the means to go above, again, that has to do with training and capacity building in the event of being affected by the shock.
All right, so due to time constraint, I have to end the question and answer session. If you have any burning question, then you can communicate with Prof. Emmanuel after the session, yeah? I'll pass the floor to the MC.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chandran.